The midnight visitors. It was a stormy night when it happened. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows of my secluded cottage on the edge of town. I was curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to come with the storm. It was nearly midnight when I heard the first knock, 3 slow, deliberate taps on the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who would be out in this weather, especially at this hour? I set the book aside and hesitated, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever was out there was becoming impatient. Reluctantly, I got up and walked to the door. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Confused, I debated whether to answer. After all, it could be someone in need of help. But something in my gut told me to stay back. Then I heard it. A child's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, let us in." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I hadn't seen anyone, but I heard the voice as clearly as if the child was standing right in front of me. I looked through the peephole again, and this time I saw them. 2 children, a boy and a girl, both around 10 years old, standing on the porch. Their clothes were soaked from the rain, and their heads were bowed, making it impossible to see their faces clearly. "Please," the boy said, lifting his head slightly. "We're lost. Can we come in?" The girl echoed his words, her voice so faint I could barely hear it. "We're cold." A shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. There was no emotion in their voices, no desperation, just a hollow, monotone tone. And then they looked up, meeting my gaze through the peephole. Their eyes? They were pitch black, like polished stones reflecting no light. No whites, no irises, just pure darkness. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The stories I had heard, the ones I had laughed off as nonsense, flashed through my mind. Black-eyed children. They were just an urban legend, a creepy tale for scaring kids on Halloween. But here they were, standing on my porch, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. "Let us in," the boy said again, more insistent this time. My mind screamed at me to shut the door, to bolt it and never look back, but my body was frozen in place. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the door, to let them inside. It was as if they were compelling me, drawing me in with those eyes. But I fought it. With every ounce of willpower, I forced myself to step away. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Go away." The knocking intensified, growing louder, more forceful. The children's voices rose in unison, now demanding, "Let us in!" I backed away, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But before the call could connect, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. The phone screen went black and the knocking stopped. I stood there in the pitch black, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. No knocking, no voices, nothing but the sound of the storm raging outside. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to peek through the peephole again. The porch was empty. The children were gone. But I knew they'd be back. They always come back. The strangers at the door. The night it all started was like any other. My wife, Sarah, and I had just settled into bed after a long day. Our 2 kids, Emily and Josh, were fast asleep down the hall, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the heater. It was a typical autumn evening, the kind where the wind rattles the windows just enough to make you grateful for the warmth inside. I was half asleep when I heard the first knock at the door. It was soft, almost tentative, but it startled me awake. I glanced at the clock, 12:30 a.m. Who could be knocking at this hour? "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, who was already sitting up, her eyes wide with concern. "Yeah," she replied, her voice low. "Who could that be?" The knocking came again, a little louder this time. I threw off the covers and got out of bed, pulling on a robe. The house was dark, and the only light came from the dim glow of the hallway nightlight. I moved quietly, trying not to wake the kids as I made my way to the front door. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Something felt off. Why would someone be knocking so late? My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a neighbor needed help, or perhaps someone's car had broken down. But as I reached for the doorknob, I paused. I decided to check the peephole first, just to be safe. I leaned forward and squinted through the tiny lens, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were 2 children standing on my porch, a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old, both dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The boy wore a dark, oversized coat, and the girl had on a pale dress that looked like it belonged in a different era. They were standing perfectly still, their faces tilted downward, making it hard to see their eyes. The porch light cast long, eerie shadows across their faces. For a moment, I considered opening the door to ask what they wanted. But then the girl slowly lifted her head and looked directly into the peephole. Her eyes were pitch black. I stumbled back from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I had heard the stories, urban legends about children with black eyes who appeared at night, asking to be let in. People said that if you let them in, terrible things would happen. I had always dismissed those stories as nonsense, just spooky tales to scare people around the campfire. But now, standing in the dark hallway of my own home, I wasn't so sure. The knocking came again, harder this time, and the boy's voice followed. "Please, sir, we're lost. We need to come in." His voice was soft, almost polite, but there was something unsettling about it. It was too calm, too controlled for a child his age. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I tried to decide what to do. "Who is it?" Sarah's voice called from the bedroom, snapping me out of my thoughts. "It's just some kids," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're asking to come in." "Kids? At this hour? What do they want?" "I don't know, but something's not right. Stay in the bedroom, okay?" She didn't argue, but I could hear the worry in her voice as she replied, "Okay. Be careful." I turned back to the door, my mind racing. The kids were still there, still knocking, still asking to be let in. The more they knocked, the harder it became to resist the urge to open the door. It was as if their voices were working their way into my mind, wearing down my defenses. But I knew I couldn't let them in. I didn't know what would happen if I did, but I was certain it wouldn't be good. "Go away!" I finally shouted through the door, my voice shaking. "You need to leave." For a moment, the knocking stopped. There was silence, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were gone. But then the boy spoke again, his voice colder, more insistent. "Please, sir, we're just kids. We're lost, and we're cold. Let us in." I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I wanted to help them. What kind of person doesn't help children in need? But every instinct screamed at me to keep the door shut, to stay away from them. Suddenly the door handle rattled, and I realized with horror that they were trying to open the door themselves. The latch held firm, but the sound of the handle jiggling sent a jolt of fear through me. "Leave!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Go away!" The rattling stopped, and for a few seconds there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for whatever came next. Then, without warning, the knocking started again. Louder, faster, more aggressive. The door shook with the force of it, and I could hear the children's voices rising, demanding to be let in. "Let us in! Let us in!" They chanted in unison, their voices growing louder and more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her face pale with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're trying to get in," I panted, my heart racing. "We need to call the police." But as I reached for my phone, the knocking suddenly stopped. The house fell silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the call button, but something told me to wait. Several minutes passed, and there was nothing. No knocking, no voices, no rattling of the door handle. Just silence. Cautiously, I crept back to the front door and peered through the peephole again. The porch was empty. The children were gone. But even as I stood there, staring out into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for another chance to get inside. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those kids. I tried to convince myself that it had just been a bad dream, or maybe some neighborhood prank, but deep down I knew it was real. The memory of those black eyes haunted me, making it hard to focus on anything else. Sarah noticed my unease, but I didn't want to burden her with my fears. I told her it was just a prank, that there was nothing to worry about. But I knew I was lying to both of us. Then 3 nights later, it happened again. It was just after midnight, and I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the feeling to pass. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. The knocking. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was the same soft, deliberate knock, the same pattern as before. I glanced at Sarah, but she was sound asleep, undisturbed by the noise. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and made my way to the front door, dreading what I might find. When I reached the door, I hesitated, listening. The knocking came again, and I steeled myself, forcing my legs to move. I looked through the peephole, my stomach twisting in knots. There they were, the same 2 children, standing on my porch, their heads bowed. The boy's coat was soaked from the rain that had started to fall, and the girl's dress clung to her small frame. They looked exactly as they had the first night, as if they hadn't moved from that spot since then. "Please, sir," the boy said, his voice muffled by the door. "We need to come in." A wave of dread washed over me. I knew better than to open the door, but the longer I stood there, the harder it was to resist. It was as if their voices were worming their way into my mind, planting thoughts that weren't my own. "Let us in," the girl whispered, her voice so faint I could barely hear it. My hand shook as I reached for the lock, but at the last second I pulled back. No, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't let them in. "Leave us alone," I shouted, my voice trembling. "Go away and don't come back." The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment, I thought they were gone. But then the boy spoke again, his voice cold and menacing. "You can't keep us out forever. We'll be back." I stumbled away from the door, my chest tight with fear. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but I was too terrified to move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn and walk back to the bedroom. The next morning, I told Sarah what had happened. I couldn't keep it from her any longer. She listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each word. When I finished, she shook her head, refusing to believe it. "Maybe it's just some kids playing a prank," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Kids these days, they find ways to scare people for fun." "I wish it were that simple," I replied, rubbing my temples. "But there's something about them, Sarah. Something wrong. Those eyes, they weren't normal." She put her hand on my shoulder, trying to comfort me, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "We'll be okay," she said, more to reassure herself than me. "We just won't open the door. They'll get bored and stop coming." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Those kids, or whatever they were, weren't going to give up so easily. Days passed, and the knocking didn't return. I began to hope that maybe Sarah was right, that the children had finally moved on. But the sense of dread never really left me. I found myself jumping at small noises, constantly checking the windows and double locking the doors. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then one night it happened again. Only this time it was different. It was late, around 1 a.m, when I woke up to the sound of knocking. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. I sat up, my heart pounding. The knocking echoed through the hallway, rhythmic and persistent, like a heartbeat. I glanced at Sarah, but she was fast asleep, oblivious to the sound. I knew I had to investigate, but fear rooted me in place. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps in the hallway, moving toward our bedroom. My breath caught in my throat. The door creaked open slowly, and I saw a shadow move across the floor. I reached over and shook Sarah awake, my voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, wake up." She stirred, blinking groggily. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Listen," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the door. We both went still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside our bedroom door. Then came a soft, almost childlike whisper. "Let us in." Sarah gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. I could feel her trembling beside me. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Please let us in. We're cold." My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I wanted to grab something, anything to defend us. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was outside our door wasn't human. We had to get out of there, but the only exit was through the hallway where those things were waiting. Suddenly, the knocking resumed, this time on our bedroom door. It was harder, more violent than before, rattling the door in its frame. The children's voices grew louder, more desperate. "Let us in! Let us in!" Panic seized me. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her out of bed. "We have to go," I whispered urgently. "We need to get the kids and get out of here." She nodded, fear etched into her face, and we crept toward the door. But as we approached, the knocking stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. I held my breath, my hand on the doorknob, and counted to 3 before yanking the door open. The hallway was empty. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I could feel their presence, lingering just out of sight. We hurried to the kids' rooms, waking them up and ushering them quietly toward the stairs. Josh, our youngest, rubbed his eyes sleepily. "Dad, what's happening?" he asked, his voice groggy with sleep. "Shh," I whispered. "We're going for a little drive, okay? Just stay close to us." We made our way downstairs, our footsteps eerily loud in the silent house. Every shadow felt like a threat, every creak of the floorboards a warning. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. As we reached the front door, I hesitated. What if they were waiting outside? What if we were walking right into their trap? But staying inside wasn't an option either. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The night was deathly quiet, the wind completely still. The porch was empty, and the street beyond was dark and deserted. But I knew they were out there, watching us, waiting for a moment of weakness. We quickly piled into the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I tore out of the driveway, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of those children. We didn't stop driving until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was old and run down, but it didn't matter. We just needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere far away from those things. As we checked in and settled into the motel room, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The kids were too tired to question what had happened, and they fell asleep quickly, huddled together in one of the beds. Sarah and I sat in silence, too shaken to sleep, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional drip of the faucet. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's over?" I shook my head, unable to lie to her. "I don't know. I hope so." But deep down, I wasn't sure it would ever be over. Those black-eyed children had found us once, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they would find us again, no matter where we went. The next morning, we returned to the house in the daylight, hoping to retrieve a few essentials and figure out our next steps. But as soon as we pulled into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. The front door was wide open, hanging off its hinges. The windows were shattered, and the air around the house felt heavy, oppressive. I told Sarah to stay in the car with the kids while I went to check inside. Stepping through the front door, I found the house in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, pictures were smashed, and a foul, rotten smell lingered in the air. But what terrified me the most was what I found scrawled on the walls, written in a childlike script. "You can't run. You can't hide. We will find you." My blood ran cold. There was no doubt in my mind now. Those things were coming for us, and no matter how far we ran, we could never escape them. We packed up our lives and left town that very day. We never spoke of what happened to anyone, not even our closest friends. But every time I hear a soft knock at the door or see shadows moving in the corner of my eye, I'm reminded of that night. They're still out there, waiting. And I know it's only a matter of time before they find us again. The boy by the road. It was late, well past midnight, and I was driving home after a long shift at work. The roads were empty, and the night was unusually dark, with thick clouds obscuring the moon and stars. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay awake, when I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road up ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a lost traveler, but as I got closer, I realized it was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and a flat cap. He was standing perfectly still, facing away from the road, his head slightly bowed. Something about the boy made me uneasy. It was strange to see a child out here all alone, especially at this hour. I slowed down and rolled down my window a bit as I pulled up beside him. "Hey, kid," I called out. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The boy didn't move or respond. I leaned out a little farther, trying to get a better look at him. That's when he turned around. My breath caught in my throat. His eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were completely black, like two deep voids staring back at me. There was no color, no white, just darkness. He gazed at me with those empty eyes, and a cold chill ran down my spine. "Can you give me a ride?" the boy asked, his voice flat and emotionless. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to drive away as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, an overwhelming compulsion to open the door and let him in. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, fighting the urge. I can't," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are your parents? Do they know you're out here?" The boy took a step closer to the car, his black eyes never leaving mine. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "just let me in." My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, but at the last second, I snapped out of it. I slammed the car into gear and hit the gas, speeding away without looking back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still shaking. When I finally dared to glance in the rearview mirror, there was no sign of the boy. The road was empty, as if he had never been there. But as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I noticed something chilling. My passenger side door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I left work. I quickly got out of the car, hurried into my house and locked every door and window. But that night, sleep wouldn't come easy. I kept hearing the boy's voice in my head, repeating that same haunting phrase, "Just let me in." And even though I never saw him again, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to stop. Someone who might not be strong enough to say no. The black-eyed visitors. I never thought much of the stories about black-eyed children. They were just urban legends, spooky tales people told to scare each other on dark nights. At least, that's what I believed, until the night I encountered them myself. It was early November, and the first signs of winter were beginning to settle over our small town. I lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts, surrounded by woods and the occasional farmland. It was peaceful out there, quiet, just the way I liked it. My days were spent working remotely as a freelance writer, and my evenings were spent in solitude, reading or watching TV. But one night, that solitude was shattered. I had been working late, trying to meet a deadline. The clock had just struck midnight when I decided to take a break and grab a cup of coffee. The house was silent except for the faint hum of my computer, and outside, a light snow had begun to fall. I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, when I heard it, a soft, tentative knock at the front door. It was so faint that I almost missed it, but when it came again, louder this time, I froze. Who could be knocking at this hour? My closest neighbour was half a mile away, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. Cautiously, I approached the door, peering through the peephole. To my surprise, 2 children stood on the porch, a boy and a girl, both around 8 or 9 years old. They were dressed strangely for the cold weather, wearing thin, outdated clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store. The boy wore a tattered jacket and jeans, while the girl had on a faded dress and a too large coat. Their heads were bowed, so I couldn't see their faces clearly. Confused, I hesitated before opening the door. When I did, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a sense of unease. The children didn't move or speak. They just stood there, as if waiting for something. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The boy lifted his head first, followed by the girl, and that's when I saw their eyes. Completely black, with no whites, no irises, just endless dark voids. A chill ran down my spine, and a primal fear took hold of me, telling me to slam the door and lock it. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as those empty eyes bore into mine. "Can we come in?" the boy asked. His voice was flat, emotionless, like it had been rehearsed. The girl remained silent, staring at me with that same unnerving gaze. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to close the door and get as far away from these children as possible. But something about them was compelling, almost hypnotic, making it hard to think clearly. "No," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "You should go home. It's late." "Please," the boy insisted, his tone now more forceful. "We're lost. We need to come in." The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We won't hurt you." I stepped back, breaking whatever spell they had over me, and slammed the door shut. My heart was racing as I locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away from the door, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Through the door, I heard them knocking again, softly at first, then more insistently. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knocks grew louder, more frantic, until they stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the house, but it was a silence filled with dread. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The children were gone, the porch empty. The only sign they had been there at all were the faint footprints in the snow, leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat as if it could protect me from the horror I had just witnessed. Every creak, every groan of the old house made me jump, convinced the children were still out there, waiting for me to let them in. Morning came, but the fear didn't fade. I called a few friends, trying to explain what had happened, but they all dismissed it as a nightmare or a prank. No one believed me. How could they? I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen those eyes. Over the next few days, I tried to put the encounter out of my mind, but the memory of those black eyes haunted me. I couldn't concentrate on my work, couldn't relax. Every time I passed by the front door, I half expected to hear that knocking again. One evening, a few days after the encounter, I found myself driving through town trying to clear my head. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and a heavy fog had settled in, making the familiar streets feel eerie and unfamiliar. As I passed by the park, I saw them again, the boy and the girl, standing by the edge of the playground, staring at me as I drove by. I almost slammed on the brakes, but something stopped me. Fear, perhaps, or a deep, instinctual sense that stopping would be a mistake. Instead, I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, they were gone. That night, I did some research. I had heard of black-eyed children before, but I had always assumed they were just another internet myth, like Slender Man or the Rake. But as I read account after account from people who had encountered these children, a disturbing pattern emerged. They always appeared in pairs, always at night, and always asking to be let in. Their eyes were completely black, devoid of any emotion or humanity. And those who did let them in, well, the stories varied, but none of them ended well. Some people reported illness, bad luck, or even death following an encounter. Others simply disappeared without a trace. I realized then that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Whatever those children were, they weren't human, and letting them into my home would have been a grave mistake. But even though I hadn't let them in, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with me. A week passed without incident. I began to think that maybe it was over, that they had moved on to someone else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It was a Saturday night, and I had settled in to watch a movie, trying to distract myself from the lingering unease that had become my constant companion. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I tried to ignore it. Then, just as the movie was reaching its climax, the power went out. The TV flickered off, plunging the house into darkness. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my phone, using its light to navigate the room. I headed for the fuse box in the basement, hoping it was just a blown circuit. But as I reached the top of the basement stairs, I heard it. The knocking, soft at first, then growing louder. My heart sank. They were back. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking continued, steady and insistent. They knew I was inside. They knew I was alone. A voice called out from the other side of the door, but this time it was different, older, rougher. "We're lost. Can we come in?" It wasn't the children this time, but I knew better. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knocking grew more frantic, as if they were pounding on the door with their fists. Then the voice changed, becoming softer, pleading, like that of a scared child. "Please, we're cold. Let us in." My hands trembled as I backed away from the door, moving toward the kitchen. The knocking grew louder, more desperate, the voices shifting from the childlike pleas to angry demands. "Let us in!" I grabbed the knife from the counter, gripping it tightly, even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. The door shook, as if something was trying to break it down. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence. I didn't dare move. I stood there in the darkness, every muscle tensed, waiting for the next knock, the next demand. But it never came. Finally, after what felt like hours, I crept to the window and peeked outside. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. They were gone. But I knew it wasn't over. They would be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually they would return. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Whatever those children or things were, they were relentless, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. I packed a bag that night, grabbed my car keys, and left without looking back. I drove for hours, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far away from that house. Eventually, I found a cheap motel and checked in, hoping to escape the terror that had followed me. The first few nights at the motel were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I barely slept, always waiting for the next knock on the door, the next sign that they had found me. But nothing happened. Days turned into a week, and then another. Slowly, I began to believe that maybe I had escaped them. Maybe the distance had broken whatever connection they had to me. I tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, though I was always on edge, never truly at peace. Then, on the 10th night at the motel, it happened. It was around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by the sound of knocking. It was the same soft, insistent knock I had heard back at the house. My blood ran cold as I sat up in bed listening. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly got out of bed and approached the door, dreading what I might see on the other side. I knew better than to look through the peephole, but the compulsion was too strong. I had to know. I took a deep breath, then pressed my eye to the peephole. There they were, the boy and the girl, standing on the other side of the door, their black eyes staring directly at me. They looked exactly the same as they had that first night, except now, their faces were twisted into expressions of anger and impatience. "Please," the boy said, his voice low and menacing. "We just need to come in." My hand shook as I backed away from the door. I had read too many stories, knew too many accounts of what happened to those who let them in. They were relentless, persistent, and would not stop until they got what they wanted. But I wouldn't give in. I couldn't. "Go away," I shouted, trying to sound brave even though I was terrified. "You're not coming in." The knocking grew louder, more violent, as if they were pounding on the door with all their strength. The walls shook with the force of it, and the air grew cold, so cold that I could see my breath. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew more intense. Then suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost worse than the noise. I stood there, shaking, waiting for whatever came next. A whisper echoed through the room, chilling me to the bone. "You can't hide forever. We'll find you." My breath hitched as the voice faded away, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I knew then that this was a game to them. They enjoyed the chase, the fear. But I couldn't keep running forever. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the motel. I knew I couldn't keep running. No matter where I went, they would find me. The stories I had read all pointed to the same conclusion. Once they had chosen you, there was no escape. I considered going to the authorities, but what could I tell them? That I was being haunted by children with black eyes. They would lock me up for sure. No, this was something I had to face on my own. I drove to a remote cabin I knew about, far off in the woods, a place where no one would find me. It had belonged to my late uncle, and as far as I knew, no one had been there in years. It was isolated, quiet, the perfect place to make a stand. When I arrived, I barricaded the door and windows, hoping that would buy me some time. I wasn't sure what I would do when they came, but I knew I had to be ready. That night, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, I sat by the fire with the old shotgun my uncle had left behind. I had no idea if it would work against them, but it gave me a small sense of comfort. The knocking started just after midnight. It was soft at first, like before, but grew louder with each passing minute. I gripped the shotgun tightly, my knuckles white, as I listened to the relentless pounding on the door. This time, I didn't go to the door. I stayed by the fire, watching the flames flicker, listening to the sound of the knocking echo through the cabin. And then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But the silence stretched on, unbroken. Finally, I dared to relax, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had given up. But then, from behind me, I heard the soft, familiar voice of the girl. "Please, let us in." I spun around, raising the shotgun, but there was no one there, just the flickering shadows cast by the fire. Then I heard it again, louder this time, coming from all around me. "Let us in." The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on me as the whispers grew louder, overlapping, echoing in the darkness. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. "Let us in." The fire went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I was completely alone, surrounded by the voices, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door, fumbled with the locks, and threw it open. The cold night air rushed in, and the voices stopped. I looked out into the darkness, but there was nothing. No children, no figures, just the empty woods. For a moment I thought I had won, but then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and found myself face to face with the boy. His black eyes stared into mine, devoid of any humanity, any soul. The girl stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "It's too late," the boy whispered. "You let us in." The world went dark. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to bloody subscribe, or the dream demons might pay you a visit. Sleep tight.